The stranger in the wreckage. The battlefield was silent now, except for the occasional crackle of broken machinery and the hiss of escaping gases. Lieutenant Jack Conrad moved carefully through the debris, his pulse rifle ready. The vast remains of the battle stretched out before him, human and alien ships scattered like broken toys across the surface of an uninhabited moon. Jack's breathing was heavy inside his helmet. The war between humanity and the Terran Dominion had been raging for years, but today's fight had been catastrophic. Ships destroyed, soldiers lost. Both sides had taken heavy damage. But Jack had survived, barely. His small escape pod had crash-landed here, and now, against all odds, he was searching for other survivors. Anybody out there? Jack's voice echoed through the ruins, amplified by his comms. But there was no response, just silence. He sighed and adjusted his grip on the rifle. This moon wasn't safe. The Terrans weren't known for mercy, and their drones were likely still patrolling the area. As Jack stepped over a chunk of twisted metal, he spotted something unusual. A faint, flickering light blinked through the smoke. His heart skipped a beat. A survivor. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. When he got closer, he froze. It wasn't just a light. There was someone, an alien, lying trapped beneath a piece of heavy debris. Her skin shimmered faintly under the pale moonlight, a bluish hue marked with intricate, glowing patterns. She was unconscious, her face partly hidden by a tattered hood. Jack's instincts screamed at him to leave her. She was Haran, one of them. She could be dangerous, a spy or worse, but something about her appearance stopped him. She didn't look like the warriors he had faced in battle. Her face was delicate, almost peaceful, and her slender hands were stretched out, as if she had been reaching for something before the debris crushed her. "Damn it," Jack muttered. His first rule of survival was to look out for himself, but his conscience wouldn't let him walk away. He knew he'd regret it later if he did. He knelt beside her and inspected the debris. It was a large chunk of metal plating, far too heavy to lift easily. "Hang in there," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. With a grunt, he pushed against the wreckage, using all his strength. The metal groaned but didn't budge. Jack glanced around, spotting a metal rod nearby. He grabbed it and wedged it under the debris, using it as a lever. This time, the wreckage shifted slightly. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he strained, his muscles burning. Finally, the piece of debris rolled off with a loud thud. The alien woman was free, but she didn't move. Jack crouched beside her, checking for signs of life. Her chest rose and fell faintly. She was breathing, but barely. Her injuries looked severe, and her strange markings seemed to dim, as if her body was losing energy. "Who are you?" Jack whispered. He reached for his med kit, hesitating for a moment. Helping her meant taking a risk. What if the Xarans were already searching for her? But leaving her here would mean certain death. He applied a coagulant to her wounds and wrapped them with bandages. Her skin felt strangely warm under his gloves, almost electric. As he worked, her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment. They were bright silver, shimmering like stars. She murmured something in a language Jack didn't understand, her voice weak and broken. "Hey, stay with me," Jack said softly, but her eyes closed again. He felt a pang of guilt. She was clearly in pain, and he couldn't just leave her here. He needed to find shelter before enemy patrols arrived. Jack lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was. She barely weighed anything, as if gravity didn't fully affect her. Slinging her over his shoulder, he began moving toward a nearby outcrop of rocks, hoping to find a place to hide. His rifle remained in his other hand, ready for any threats. As he trudged through the wreckage, a familiar sound made his blood run cold. A low, mechanical hum echoed in the distance. Terran drones. They were searching the battlefield, their sharp beams of light cutting through the smoke. "Of course," Jack muttered under his breath. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding. If the drones spotted him with the alien woman, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd just shoot. Finally, Jack found a small cave nestled in the rocks. It wasn't much, but it would do. He slipped inside and gently set the woman down, leaning her against the wall. She looked even weaker now, her breathing shallow. Outside, the hum of the drones grew louder. Jack peered out of the cave, his rifle ready. The drones hovered nearby, scanning the wreckage. His grip tightened on the weapon. If they found him, he'd have to fight, and he wasn't sure he could protect both himself and the woman. Just stay quiet, he whispered to himself, hoping the drones would pass. The woman stirred slightly, her lips moving as if she were trying to speak. Jack leaned closer, but her words were too faint to hear. He didn't know who she was or why she was here, but one thing was clear: she was important. And now, for better or worse, her survival was tied to his. Outside, the drones began to move away, their lights fading into the distance. Jack exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Whoever this woman was, she was in danger, and now so was he. For some reason, though, he couldn't shake the feeling that saving her had been the right choice. Secrets beneath the cloak. The night was eerily quiet inside the cave, save for the faint crackling of a small emergency heater Jack had set up. The woman lay motionless against the cold rock wall, her breathing shallow but steady. Jack sat a few feet away, his pulse rifle resting across his lap, his eyes flickering between the cave entrance and her still form. He wasn't sure why he'd saved her. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to abandon her and find a way off this moon. Yet something about her didn't let him walk away. Those glowing markings on her skin, it was as if they told a story he wasn't yet meant to know. Suddenly, she stirred, her head tilted slightly, and her silvery eyes blinked open, glowing faintly in the dim light. Jack instinctively tightened his grip on his rifle but didn't raise it. Her gaze locked onto his, filled with confusion and fear. "You're awake," he said softly, keeping his tone calm. "Don't move too much. You're injured." Her eyes darted around the cave, taking in her surroundings before landing on him again. She said something in her alien tongue, soft, melodic, and completely unintelligible. Jack frowned, wishing he could understand her. "Look, I don't know if you can understand me," he said, gesturing to himself. "Human, Jack Conrad. I found you out there and pulled you out of the wreckage. You're safe. For now." Her brow furrowed slightly as if trying to make sense of his words. Then she raised a shaky hand to her hood and pulled it down. For the first time, Jack saw her face fully. She was undeniably Terran, but unlike any he'd encountered before. Her features were elegant and almost regal, with those glowing, swirling markings trailing down her cheeks and neck. Jack leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Who are you?" Instead of answering, she reached up and touched the glowing band around her wrist. A faint holographic projection flickered to life, displaying a map of the galaxy with several marked locations. Jack's eyes widened as he recognized some of the coordinates, strategic locations that humanity had fought to protect. "Wait," he said, pointing to the projection. Are you a spy? Is that why they're after you?" Her eyes flared with anger, and she spoke again in her language, her tone sharp and defensive. She shook her head vigorously, clearly offended by his accusation. Jack held up his hands in a placating gesture. All right. Not a spy. Got it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This would be a lot easier if we could actually understand each other." As if responding to his frustration, the woman's wristband emitted a soft chime. The hologram shifted, and her voice was replaced by a mechanical translation. "I am not your enemy." Jack blinked, startled. "Well, that's a relief," he muttered, then added, "Who are you then? Why are they after you?" She hesitated, her glowing markings dimming slightly as if reflecting her unease. "My name is Laria," the translator finally said. "I am of royal blood." Jack stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Royal blood. You mean, you're a princess? Laria gave a small nod, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. They want me dead, she said, her voice trembling slightly. If I fall, the resistance will crumble. The resistance. Jack's mind raced. The Xarans were known for their ruthless empire, but rumors of an internal rebellion had always been dismissed as wishful thinking. If Laria was telling the truth, she was far more valuable than he'd realized. Before he could press further, a faint hum echoed from outside the cave. Jack stiffened, immediately reaching for his rifle. He gestured for Laria to stay quiet and crept toward the entrance. Peering out, his stomach dropped. A squad of Xaran soldiers was combing the area, their glowing visors cutting through the darkness. They found us, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. He turned back to Laria, who was struggling to sit up. Her markings flickered faintly, as if her body was running out of energy. I can't fight them off and protect you at the same time, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. Do you have any tricks up your sleeve? Anything that can help? Laria looked at him, her expression pained. If I use my power, they will know where I am. Jack clenched his jaw. They already know. It's us or them, princess. You decide. Her silver eyes darkened for a moment before she closed them, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The markings on her skin began to glow brighter, illuminating the cave with an otherworldly light. Jack shielded his eyes as a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. What the hell are you doing? He shouted over the noise. Laria didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand, and a pulse of energy erupted from her body, shooting out of the cave like a shockwave. Jack stumbled back, the force nearly knocking him off his feet. Outside, the Xaran soldiers cried out as the energy hit them, their weapons shorting out and their bodies collapsing to the ground. The cave fell silent once more. Jack stared at Laria in awe and disbelief. She slumped against the wall, her glow fading rapidly. You just wiped them out, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you? Laria looked at him, her expression weary but defiant. A queen, in exile, she murmured before falling unconscious once more. Jack sat back, his mind racing. Whatever he'd gotten himself into, it was far bigger than he'd imagined. And now, there was no turning back. The chase. The cave had become a temporary sanctuary, but Jack knew it wouldn't last. The Xaran patrols were relentless, and now, with Laria's pulse wave revealing their location, it was only a matter of time before reinforcements arrived. He stood near the entrance, his pulse rifle in hand, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Behind him, Laria stirred. She was pale, her glowing markings dim and flickering like a dying flame. Whatever power she had used, it had drained her almost completely. Jack glanced over his shoulder, his voice low but firm. Can you walk? He asked. She opened her eyes weakly, her voice barely audible. I will try. Jack sighed, moving back to her. Look, if we stay here, we're dead. They'll send more soldiers, maybe drones. We have to keep moving. Laria nodded, her silver eyes glinting faintly as she struggled to push herself upright. Jack crouched beside her, offering his arm for support. Her touch was light, almost weightless, but he could feel her trembling. She wasn't in any condition to run, let alone fight. Stay close to me, he said as he helped her to her feet. If anything happens, don't stop. Just keep going. Outside, the landscape was desolate and treacherous. Sharp rocks jutted out of the ground like jagged teeth, and the air was thick with smoke and ash from the recent battle. Jack led the way, keeping Laria close behind him. Every step was a calculated risk, every shadow a potential threat. They hadn't gone far when Jack's comm device crackled to life. A distorted voice came through, cold and mechanical. Human soldier, surrender the royal fugitive, and you may yet live. Jack froze, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. The voice wasn't coming from his comm. It was being broadcast across the area. Laria stiffened beside him, her grip tightening on his arm. "I don't suppose you've got a plan for this," he whispered. Laria's gaze was hard, her exhaustion replaced by a flicker of defiance. "They want me alive. They will kill. Keep moving." Jack smirked despite the danger. Comforting. They pressed on, but the voice followed them, growing louder. The Xerans were closing in, and Jack knew it. His heart pounded as he spotted a narrow canyon up ahead, its twisting paths offering potential cover. "This way," he said, guiding Laria toward the canyon. The walls were high and steep, their surfaces covered in strange, luminescent moss. The light from the moss cast eerie shadows, making it hard to tell where the enemy might be. As they navigated the narrow pathways, the hum of Xeran drones grew louder. Jack's instincts kicked into overdrive. He pushed Laria into a small alcove and crouched beside her, raising his rifle. The sound of the drones echoed through the canyon, their searchlights sweeping the area. Jack's finger hovered over the trigger. He could see the faint outlines of the drones moving above them, their sleek forms casting long shadows on the canyon walls. If even one of them spotted them, it would be over. Laria leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "They are not just looking for me. They can sense my energy." Jack glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Well, that's fantastic. Can you turn it off?" She shook her head. "Not completely." Before Jack could respond, a drone's searchlight swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. He held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. The light paused for a moment, then moved on. He exhaled slowly, motioning for Laria to stay quiet. But the reprieve didn't last long. A metallic clatter echoed through the canyon, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on stone. The Xeran soldiers were here, and they weren't alone. Jack risked a glance around the corner and saw them. 3 heavily armed warriors accompanied by a towering insect-like mech. Its glowing red eyes scanned the area, its movements deliberate and menacing. "Great," Jack muttered under his breath. "Now they've got a walking tank." Laria's voice was urgent. "We must go. Now." "No argument there," Jack said. He grabbed her hand and began leading her deeper into the canyon, his mind racing for a way out. The sound of the mech's heavy footsteps grew louder behind them, and Jack knew they couldn't outrun it for long. Suddenly, Laria stumbled, nearly pulling them both to the ground. Jack caught her, his frustration evident. "You're slowing us down." Her eyes met his, filled with determination despite her weakened state. "Then leave me." Jack shook his head. "Not happening. We both get out of this, or neither of us does." Before she could argue, a bright light flooded the canyon. The mech had found them, its massive form blocking their escape route. Jack raised his rifle, knowing it would do little against the armored beast. The mech's voice boomed, cold and mechanical. "Surrender the princess, or you will die." Jack's mind raced. He glanced at Laria, who was clutching her side, clearly in pain. She met his gaze, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. She reached for the glowing device on her wrist, but Jack stopped her. "No," he said firmly. "You're barely standing. Let me handle this." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Jack turned back to the mech, his grip tightening on his rifle. He didn't have a plan, just a stubborn refusal to give up. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "here goes nothing." And with that, he charged. A princess revealed. The silence after the battle was deafening. Jack stood amidst the wreckage of the Terran mech, smoke rising from its shattered remains. His pulse rifle was nearly out of energy, and his hands trembled from the sheer effort it had taken to bring the thing down. Laria sat slumped against a rock nearby, her face pale, her glowing markings flickering weakly. For a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to breathe. They had survived, but just barely. "You're insane," Laria said, her voice strained but tinged with an edge of disbelief. You charged that thing. Jack turned to her, smirking despite the exhaustion etched across his face. You're welcome. Laria's gaze softened, but she said nothing more. Instead, she reached up, her hand trembling, and activated the device on her wrist. A soft hum filled the air, followed by a holographic projection that enveloped them both. Jack's jaw dropped as the scene unfolded. He saw a sprawling Xaren palace, golden and shimmering under twin suns. Soldiers in ornate armor stood at attention, while alien dignitaries bowed in reverence. At the center of it all stood Laria, clad in flowing robes, a crown of energy resting atop her head. Her glowing markings were radiant, pulsing with strength and authority. You really are a princess, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Laria nodded, her expression unreadable. I was the heir to the throne of the Terran Dominion, but I couldn't follow the path my family laid out for me. The hologram shifted, now showing scenes of destruction. Cities burned, alien refugees fled, and Xaren soldiers marched through the ruins. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized human colonies among the devastation. My father, Laria continued, her voice trembling, ruled through fear and violence. He sought to conquer, to crush any who stood in his way. I couldn't stand by and let it continue. So you left? Jack asked, piecing the story together. I didn't just leave, Laria said, her silver eyes meeting his. I stole something, a weapon, a chance to end his reign and free those who suffer under his tyranny. Jack's brow furrowed. A weapon? What kind of weapon? Laria hesitated, her markings dimming slightly as if reflecting her unease. It's not a physical weapon, she said. It's a secret, knowledge that could unite the scattered factions of the galaxy against my father's empire. But if he finds me before I can deliver it. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jack understood all too well. If the Xaren Emperor captured her, everything she had fought for would be lost. And you trust me with all of this? Jack asked, leaning against his rifle. Why? Laria's gaze didn't waver. Because you saved me. You had no reason to, yet you did. That is rare. Jack scratched the back of his neck, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. Well, don't get too sentimental. I'm still not sure this wasn't a mistake. Before Laria could respond, the wrist device beeped urgently. Her expression darkened as she studied the display. They're coming, she said, her voice tight. A full battalion. My father doesn't take chances. Jack swore under his breath. Of course he doesn't. All right, princess, what's the plan? Because I'm fresh out of ideas, and I doubt I can punch my way out of this one. Laria hesitated, her eyes scanning the horizon. There's an old resistance outpost nearby, she said. If we can reach it, we might stand a chance. Might. Jack raised an eyebrow. Not exactly inspiring confidence. It's our only option, Laria said firmly. And it's better than waiting here to die. Jack couldn't argue with that. He helped her to her feet, her weight pressing heavily against him. She was weaker than she let on, but there was a determination in her eyes that matched his own. As they made their way toward the outpost, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger than himself. He was just a soldier, a grunt in a war he didn't fully understand. But now, with Laria at his side, he felt a strange sense of purpose. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. Allies in the shadows. The resistance outpost was not what Jack expected. Hidden deep beneath the surface of a desolate moon, it was carved into a massive underground cavern. The entrance, disguised as a jagged cliff face, opened to reveal a sprawling network of tunnels and chambers lit by soft, bioluminescent lights. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of hope and desperation. Jack and Laria were escorted into the heart of the base by a group of resistance fighters, their mismatched armor and weaponry a stark contrast to the polished military discipline Jack was used to. They moved quickly, their faces guarded but curious, especially when they glanced at Laria. It was clear they recognized her, though no one dared speak her name aloud. "Looks cozy," Jack muttered as they entered a large central chamber. It was filled with holographic maps, communication consoles, and a handful of exhausted-looking fighters. "But I've seen better hideouts." Laria shot him a look. "These people are risking their lives. Show some respect." Before Jack could respond, a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped forward. His face was scared, his eyes sharp and calculating. He carried himself with the air of someone who had seen too many battles and survived them all. "Laria," the man said, his voice a deep rumble. "You're alive." "I am, Commander Tarek," Laria replied, her tone formal but warm. "Thanks to him." She gestured toward Jack. Tarek's gaze shifted to Jack, sizing him up with a single, piercing glance. "Human, ha. What's your story?" Jack crossed his arms, unfazed. "No story. Just a guy who doesn't like bullies. And from what I've seen, your empire fits the bill." Tarek's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Fair enough." He turned back to Laria. "We've been tracking your father's forces. They're getting closer. Whatever plan you have, we need to act fast." Laria nodded, stepping forward to activate a holographic display. The map showed the galaxy, with key points marked in red and blue. Jack recognized the red as Karen-controlled territories, an overwhelming majority. "This," Laria said, pointing to a cluster of blue dots, "is our last hope. Independent factions, scattered and divided. If we can unite them, we have a chance to stand against my father's empire." Jack frowned. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "From what I've seen, most of these groups barely trust their own shadows." Laria's markings began to glow faintly, a sign of her determination. "They'll trust me. My father's reign is built on lies, fear, and control. I carry the truth, and the proof of his crimes." Tarek folded his arms. "Even if they believe you, it won't be enough. We need firepower, ships, soldiers. Right now, we're outnumbered and outgunned." Jack leaned against a console, thinking, what about humanity? The fleet might be battered, but if we could get a message through. "No," Laria interrupted, her voice firm. "Your people won't listen. They see all Xerans as enemies. If they find out who I am, they'll shoot me on sight." Jack didn't argue. She was right, but that didn't mean he liked it. He watched as Tarek and Laria strategized, their words blending into a blur. His mind drifted, replaying everything that had led him here. He was a soldier, trained to follow orders, but now he was part of something far bigger, a rebellion that could reshape the galaxy. A sharp chime pulled him from his thoughts. One of the resistance fighters rushed into the room, his face pale. "Commander, we've picked up enemy signals. They've landed on the surface. They're deploying recon teams." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Laria, waiting for her decision. She squared her shoulders, her markings glowing brighter. "We hold them off as long as we can, but we must prepare to leave. The truth I carry cannot fall into my father's hands." Tarek nodded, barking orders to his team. The room erupted into controlled chaos as fighters grabbed weapons and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Jack moved to Laria's side, his pulse rifle already in hand. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. She met his gaze, her silver eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's suffered under my father's rule. I have to do this." Jack smirked, tapping his rifle. "Well, I hope your grand plan works, Princess, because if it doesn't, we're all toast." Laria gave him a faint smile. "It will work. I won't let it fail." Outside, the first echoes of battle began to reach the chamber. Explosions, shouts, and the unmistakable hum of Xaran drones. Jack's grip tightened on his weapon. "Let's hope you're right," he said, his tone grim, "because the fight just found us." The final stand. The underground base was in chaos. Explosions echoed through the tunnels. shaking the walls and sending clouds of dust cascading from the ceiling. Resistance fighters scrambled to hold their positions, their mismatched weapons barely holding back the advancing Terran forces. The glow of their plasma rifles painted the cavern walls in flashes of red and blue, turning the battle into a nightmarish light show. Jack ducked behind a steel support beam, firing off a burst from his pulse rifle. The advancing Terran soldiers moved in unison, their precision cold and mechanical. They weren't just trying to kill, they were trying to capture. Jack knew who their target was. "Laria," he shouted over the roar of gunfire. "We're out of time. What's the plan?" Laria stood at the center of the chamber, her glowing markings flickering like a dying star. She was exhausted, her strength drained from days of running and the weight of her mission. Yet there was no hesitation in her eyes. "There's an escape route," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "A tunnel that leads to the surface. We can use it to get to the ships." Jack frowned, firing another round at a Terran soldier who got too close. "And leave everyone else to die. That's not a plan. It's a death sentence." Laria turned to him, her gaze steady. "If they capture me, this war is over. My father will crush the rebellion, and countless more will die. We have no choice." Jack swore under his breath. He hated running, but she was right. He glanced at Tarek, who was barking orders to his fighters. "Tarek, can you hold them off?" Tarek gave a grim nod. "We'll do what we can. Get her out of here." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Jack had barely known these people, yet they were willing to sacrifice everything for Laria's mission. "For her." "Fine," Jack muttered, turning back to Laria. "Let's move." They made their way toward the tunnel entrance, dodging plasma fire and leaping over debris. Jack's pulse rifle was almost out of charge, but he kept firing, each shot buying them precious seconds. Laria stayed close, her movements slower but deliberate. As they reached the tunnel, a deafening roar filled the air. Jack turned just in time to see a massive Terran war mech step into the chamber. Its hulking form towered over the resistance fighters, its glowing red eyes scanning the room like a predator stalking its prey. "Oh, come on," Jack groaned, raising his rifle. Another one. The mech's cannon powered up, emitting a high-pitched whine that made Jack's stomach twist. He grabbed Laria, pulling her into the tunnel just as the mech fired. The blast shook the ground, collapsing part of the chamber behind them. "We can't outrun that thing," Jack shouted, his voice echoing in the narrow tunnel. Laria's markings glowed brighter, illuminating the path ahead. "We won't have to." Jack stopped in his tracks, turning to face her. "What does that mean?" She met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I have enough energy left for one final attack. I can destroy it." Jack's stomach dropped. "And what happens to you if you do that?" Laria hesitated, then looked away. "It doesn't matter." "The hell it doesn't," Jack snapped, grabbing her arm. "You said it yourself. This mission falls apart if you're gone. You can't just." "I don't have a choice," Laria shouted, her voice breaking. "If I don't stop that mech, none of us will make it out of here alive." Jack stared at her, his mind racing. Every part of him wanted to argue, to find another way. But deep down, he knew she was right. The mech was unstoppable, and the resistance was running out of time. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "But I'm not leaving you." Laria's expression softened, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. "You're stubborn." "Yeah, well," Jack said, smirking despite himself, "you're not exactly easy to deal with either." Together, they turned back toward the chamber. The mech was tearing through the resistance fighters, its cannon obliterating everything in its path. Jack raised his rifle, firing at its joints in a desperate attempt to slow it down. It was futile, but it gave Laria the time she needed. She stepped forward, her markings glowing brighter than ever. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, crackling with invisible power. Jack watched in awe as she raised her hands, her entire body radiating light. "Get down," she shouted. Jack dove behind a pile of debris as a blinding wave of energy erupted from Laria. The mech froze mid-step, its red eyes dimming as the energy tore through its circuits. The force of the blast shook the cavern, knocking Jack off his feet. When the dust settled, the mech was nothing more than a smoking heap of metal. The chamber was eerily silent, the surviving resistance fighters staring in disbelief. Jack pushed himself to his feet, his heart pounding as he searched for Laria. She was on the ground, her glow nearly extinguished. Jack rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. "Laria, hey, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, her voice barely a whisper. "Did we win?" Jack managed a shaky smile. Yeah, we won." But as he looked at her, her markings dimming with every passing second, he realized the cost of their victory. A new alliance. The starship's engines roared to life, lifting off from the desolate moon with a shudder that reverberated through the hull. Jack sat in the cockpit, his hands gripping the controls tightly, sweat dripping down his face. Beside him, Laria lay unconscious, her body wrapped in a thermal blanket. Her once brilliant markings were faint now, barely flickering with the light that had once seemed limitless. Behind them, the resistance base was gone, obliterated in the final moments of the Terran assault. The handful of survivors had made it aboard, but the mood was grim. They had won a battle, but at a cost that no one could ignore. "Status," Jack called out to the resistance fighter monitoring the ship's sensors. "We're clear for now," the fighter replied, his voice shaky. "No enemy ships on our tail, but it won't take them long to figure out where we're headed." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. The destination was no mystery. Laria had given them the coordinates before collapsing. A neutral system, far from the Terran Empire's reach. A place where the independent factions might still be convinced to join the fight. If they got there in time. The medbay was eerily quiet. Jack sat beside Laria's cot, watching her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. The ship's medic had done all they could, but it wasn't enough. Laria's condition wasn't something human medicine could fix. Whatever power she had tapped into during the battle had left her drained, physically, mentally, and perhaps even spiritually. Jack leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You better wake up, princess," he muttered. "You didn't drag me into this mess just to check out now." He wasn't sure why he was talking to her. Maybe it was because the silence was unbearable. Maybe it was because he couldn't shake the image of her standing in that chamber, her light blazing, as she faced down the mech. She had been fearless, determined, willing to sacrifice herself for something bigger than any one person. And now, here she was, fragile, vulnerable, and fading. The door to the medbay hissed open, and Tarek stepped in. The resistance commander looked as worn out as Jack felt, his armor scorched, and his expression grim. "How is she?" Tarek asked. Jack shook his head. "Not good. She's alive. But I don't know for how long." Tarek crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on Laria. "She's more than just a symbol, you know. If she dies, everything falls apart. The factions won't unite without her." "Yeah, I got that," Jack said, his voice laced with frustration. "But what am I supposed to do? I'm not a miracle worker." Tarek's expression softened slightly. "You've already done more than anyone could have expected. Getting her this far, it's no small thing." Jack didn't respond. He wasn't in the mood for reassurances. Instead, he stood, pacing the small medbay. "What's the plan then?" "We show up, wave a flag, and hope these factions don't shoot us on sight." "They'll listen to her," Tarek said, "if she wakes up." Jack stopped, his back to Tarek. "She will," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "She has to." The meeting hall on the neutral planet was a far cry from the grandeur of the Terran Empire. It was a functional space. Plain walls, utilitarian furniture, and a distinct lack of ceremony. Representatives from the independent factions filled the room, their faces a mix of suspicion and curiosity. They were a disparate group, Hardened warlords, weary diplomats, and scrappy freedom fighters. None of them looked particularly eager to cooperate. Jack stood at the edge of the room, his pulse rifle slung over his shoulder. He felt out of place here, a soldier in a sea of politics. But this wasn't his fight to lead. It was hers. The door at the far end of the room slid open, and the murmurs died down. Laria entered, flanked by Tarek and 2 resistance fighters. She moved slowly, her body still recovering, but her presence was undeniable. Her markings glowed faintly, a testament to her resolve. The room fell silent as she stepped forward, her silver eyes scanning the crowd. She was no longer just a fugitive or a princess in hiding. She was a leader. "I stand before you not as a Haran royal," Laria began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "but as a servant of those who suffer. My father's empire has brought pain and destruction to countless worlds, your worlds. But together, we can stop him." A murmur rippled through the crowd, skepticism thick in the air. One of the representatives, a burly man with a scared face, stood. "And why should we trust you? You're one of them." Laria met his gaze without flinching. "Because I chose to turn against everything I was taught. I chose to fight for freedom, even when it meant losing everything. And because I carry the truth." She raised her wrist, activating the hologram. Images of the Haran Empire's atrocities filled the room. Burning cities, enslaved populations, and planets stripped of resources. Gasps and mutters spread through the crowd. "This is what we're fighting against," Laria said, her voice rising. "And this is what we can end, if we stand together." Jack watched from the sidelines, his chest tightening. She was weak, barely standing, but she was still fighting. For them, for him, for something bigger than any one person. The room erupted into debate, voices overlapping as the representatives argued. But Jack could see it, the shift, the spark of hope that Laria had ignited. Tarek stepped up beside him. "She's something else, isn't she?" Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, she really is." Hours later, as the factions began to agree on terms of alliance, Jack found Laria sitting alone in the corner of the hall. She looked exhausted but relieved, the faint glow of her markings reflecting her quiet satisfaction. "You did it," Jack said, sitting beside her. "We did it," she corrected, her smile faint but genuine. "This is only the beginning." Jack chuckled softly. "You know, I signed up to be a soldier, not a revolutionary. And yet here you are," Laria said, her voice warm. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jack shrugged, leaning back against the wall. "Guess I'm just stubborn like that." As they sat in silence, the weight of their journey settling over them, Jack couldn't help but feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The galaxy wasn't saved. Not yet. But for the first time, it felt like it could be. And that was enough.